finalizing a publisher for a next book, which is going to be called the DIY career, or the do-it-yourself career. So we'll be working on some career development next. To do the research for the 2020 workplace, we surveyed 2,200 working professionals around the world to find out what they wanted from a job next. We also surveyed 300 heads of HR to find out what kinds of things they were planning on offering next. And the interesting thing that we found about the 2,200 working professionals was that it didn't matter what your education level was, or your gender, or what country you were from. The biggest distinguishing factor that defined what you wanted from work was age. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what that means. As it turns out, since I'm a baby boomer, I am more like a baby boomer in India in terms of what I want from work than I am a millennial in Colorado, which is where I live. So three big forces that we think are going to be shaping the future of work, and I'm only going to talk about a couple of these just because of time. One is globalization, and I really recommend reading Thomas Friedman on that and seeing what he's writing about. But I think that the interesting thing to think about from a globalization perspective is that we can get talent from anywhere in the world, and growing economies are increasingly scouring the world for talent. So even if we've got great universities graduating students locally, they've got the opportunity to work anywhere in the world. By 2020, there are many demographics that are shifting. A significant one is age, but it's also true that in the U.S. more non-Caucasian babies are born than Caucasian now. Women graduated starting a year and a half ago with more PhDs than men for the first time in history. So lots of changes happening there. And then finally, the social web is really changing how we experience our lives outside work, and that is beginning to shape how we experience life inside work. And just as a reminder, 10 years ago, Mark Zuckerberg, who's the founder of Facebook, was in high school, and Google had just graduated from a garage. So when you kind of think about all the changes that have happened in terms of how we connect to one another socially in the last 10 years during the Great Recession, how much more will those technologies begin to adapt and shift going forward? Just to kind of set some context on age, this is for the U.S., so just defining generations. We've tried to use just what most of the media were using. I think the interesting thing to note here is that millennials are the biggest generation now in existence, and that Gen X is a small generation. This looks the same, this pattern looks the same around the world with just a few countries an exception. And one of the big reasons Gen X is a smaller generation is that women started going back into the workforce. Birth control became available in the early 60s, widely used, and women delayed having their first child. So it just made that generation kind of slip into the next generation. The average woman is now 7 years older than she was prior to that period when she has her first child. And so you can kind of play this out. Here's a view of the workforce in 2005. So if you were in the workforce in 2005, you probably experienced something like this, where baby boomers make up about half of them, and Gen X had come into the workforce as well. Already in 2005, Gen Y is in the workforce, and then you look at 2010, and you can see that it's starting to shift. 2011, the leading edge of baby boomers started turning 65, and then you get to 2015, only a little over a year away, and you can start to see that Generation Y is really in control. So yeah, I've got my control panel kind of sitting in the way here. So now we have generational percentages for 2020 sitting at half the workforce are going to be millennials. I think there's a lot of implications for that, not the least of which, from a learning and development perspective, is that we are losing this knowledge and experience that sits in the organization. So, so let's imagine what this means. If every day in the U.S. 10,000 baby boomers are retiring, and let's say that they've at least got 35 years of experience, how much experience is walking out the door every day? And when we go back to this slide, if you took every job that a baby boomer had vacated and tried to give it to someone who's Gen X, you don't have enough people. So we have to give jobs that have been filled by people with lots of experience to people with, on average, 20 years less experience. And what's that going to mean from a learning and development experience? And then I think the other question to ask is, well, then how much does experience matter? I mean, Malcolm Gladwell popularized the concept of it takes 10 years to become an expert in something, and that's practicing every day or 10,000 hours of practice. Do we need experts in every job, or do we have a lot of jobs that we need experts in? So, just kind of philosophically, how much experience actually matters? Is it just really the first couple of years, or on average do we need people with 10 years experience or so on? So as you think about that, as baby boomers are leaving leaving the workplace, we're all going to be in competition for the experienced workers. So what do we have in place that will help us get those the best of the less experienced workers? Stephanie, she's asked the question, does it seem as though Gen Xers are being passed over? I think there's a couple of things. Jokingly, I sometimes say, are they going to be like Prince Charles, where they're just having to wait for the Queen to abdicate or decease, or is it going to skip over to one of his sons? I think, though, that the interesting thing in our data was that when we looked at what do people want from work, Gen X was more similar to the millennials in what they wanted from work. So I think they'll be a great bridge generation. That we're going to need them for the leadership experiences because there's just not enough people with experience. So I think they've had to wait a long time to get into big roles, but if they're still willing and ambitious enough, I think they're going to be able to take those steps. Yeah, David, if you haven't read the sobering book, Why Good People Can't Get Jobs, by someone from your neck of the woods, Peter Capelli, I just highly recommend that as a book because it really lays out kind of what is this deceiving lower cost option and how do we start to think about that. But the other dynamic that's starting to play out is that at the very same time people are starting to decide to work longer. So it leads you to the question, will we end up with 5 generations in the workplace, that you're not only working with your parents, but you might be working with your grandparents or great-grandparents. We interviewed someone who was 104 and still in the workplace. I had a friend at a technology company who is in HR and had to have a discussion with a woman that a performance discussion about not fulfilling her job roles, and she was 99. So, so we've got people who can be in the workplace longer periods of time as the kind of at the Six Sigma edge. The average retirement age is going up slightly, so it'll be interesting to see, what the economy does. So we wrote an article for Harvard Business Review on how to mentor millennials, and we sorted our data then by what is it that people want from a boss. Hey Bob, I'm not sure if it was Bob or Bobby, but let me get to that because I actually have an example from American Express on COBOL that I think would be interesting. But so the 5 top things they want, if you look at these, you think, wow, maybe 4 out of 5 of these are actually about development. Career paths, feedback, mentoring, coaching, formal development. The only one that isn't is comfortable with flexible schedules. And we're hearing this increasingly. This has been reinforced even more since our original research. So I think this is hopefully very promising for the learning and development field in terms of what is it that that millennials want from work, and how can we prepare them. And this is what they want from their organizations, somebody that can develop their skills for the future, strong values, and offering a clear career path. We ran an additional study at Success Factors on, what's the number one benefit people are asking for. And so we asked recruiters, and they said that 40% are saying millennials are likely to ask for training during the recruiting process, during the job interview. Whereas Gen X, who are further along in their career, have families more than likely, preparing those kids for college, are likely to ask for a higher job title. And then once they get hired, millennials say they want help finding a mentor. And Gen X is more likely to ask for a promotion. Just a few other things from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. 63% of the millennials say that what keeps them at work is that they have benefits right now, but half of them say that they would like to leave their job in the next year. Another half would also say they'd like to become entrepreneurs. More so from incoming evaluations of freshmen in college and graduating seniors, both ends, the choices about work life are increasing in importance over prior generations. And so one statistic says 75% of their career decisions are made based on what their work-life balance are. And roles in the family are changing with, in 1985, 14% of married fathers were the primary grocery shoppers, and now it's over half. So, so I think that's interesting. And the number one reason millennials leave their jobs that is cited is just inefficient communication and bureaucracy. I think those are kind of interesting as we think about who's going to be half our workforce, half of our customers, half our suppliers, half of the people that we have in our learning and development programs, half of the people that are eventually in leadership. So, and here's something else we interested. Of course, Jean and I are very interested in the learning and development field, and so we gave them a dozen ways to learn. And this really sorted by age, so which I think is interesting. The number one way millennials want to learn is mentoring and coaching. So now let's think about how are millennials around the world using social media. And so I'm going to pull from Cisco's social media survey of millennials. 2/3 will ask about social media during the job interview, and over half won't take a job from a company that bans it. 1/3 of millennials prioritize their social media access over salary, which I think is completely interesting.
So what I was saying about communication is that we've relied on email so heavily as our communication platform, and from just like how people are using email, it's increasingly that young people are not using it. In other words, if you've tried to send an email to a millennial in your life, you know that it's hard to get them, and yet older people are using it even more. So even fundamentally how we communicate with one another is changing. And probably the only reason that 18 to 24-year-olds is into steeper decline is because that's maybe when they have to use email for the first time. You know, there's about 7 billion people on the planet, and they're texting at the rate of 19 billion a day, so which is just amazing. About 170 billion tweets last year. 1.5 billion entities on Facebook, although, you know, some of them are cats and dogs. And it's a global phenomenon, you know, whether it's this or Weibo or whatever it might be. You know, people are increasingly using social platforms to communicate with one another. You know, there's over 700 million people who log on daily on Facebook. You know, interestingly, the highest traffic is midweek between 1 and 3, so today would be a good day to get on between 1 and 3 if you're trying to, you know, communicate with your friends. Whereas the longest time people spend, the, you know, interaction is highest on Thursdays and Fridays. And on the web, 1 in 5 of the views on the web is on Facebook. You know, I think it's really interesting to look at what's happening with video, whether it's YouTube, where there's 6 billion hours of YouTube's videos watched monthly, or, you know, as this translates into learning, kind of the Khan Academy. So can you put in the chat if you're familiar with the Khan Academy, just yes or no, because I think that's a really interesting way for us to begin to think about even, you know, what are the implications for e-learning. So it sounds like most people have. And, you know, I think one of the things that's interesting about that is, yeah, I've seen, Melissa, some of the commercials with Khan Academy. And yet when you kind of go to their website, you know, it's a very plain website. And the e-learning, if you want to call it that, the video, is very, very simple and plain. Yeah, Bobby, I met Sal too. He's, you know, really humble, you know, interesting guy, and he's designed, at least, you know, when I talked to him a year ago, he had designed all of the courses himself. And, you know, a few things that I think are interesting about that, you know, it's 10 minutes long or less. And when you talk to people who've gone through it, you know, if you had a tutor, you might only ask a tutor to repeat something once or twice or maybe 3 times. And yet they don't go more than 3 times. But if you're going to watch a YouTube video, you might watch it 20 times in order to get it. So it takes away the social stigma associated with it. Another person I was talking to said, you know, something he happened upon that he didn't even realize is that because we're so tuned to watching expressions on human faces, it detracts from our learning to some degree. And so none of his little videos have faces. So the talking heads kind of video is not part of the Khan Academy. And so it makes him, you know, people focus on the learning. So I think that's, you know, I think that's really interesting. You know, really good question. Why aren't there more of these? You know, when you think about it, the breadth of content that he covers and so on, I mean, there is a certain level of brilliance and that, you know, it's free. And so most people that are trying to figure out how to use it online, put online learning, are trying to make money off of it in a way that he's not trying to do. So, you know, I think maybe the commercial aspects of it prevent it. And this next generation behind him, so the next generation that's entering school now, you know, some really interesting things about that. The ones that are the generation that's entering college this year in the U.S. are the first generation that have been all in No Child Left Behind. And as I've talked to college professors, they say very, very focused on the test. And so it'll be really interesting to see what implications that has for us as those learners come into the workforce when they have been so focused on the test as opposed to, you know, conceptual learning. I'm just going to skip a couple of slides just because we lost a tad bit of time, and they're more about kind of social. So just like a few examples of what people are doing now. Since learners were so interested in in mentoring from the millennial generation, a couple of things that we've seen people do are think about how do you scale mentoring. So instead of one-on-one as a kind of traditional approach, what AT&T has done is require managers to be a mentor, but they're doing it on a platform. And they can buddy up. So, so I could join forces with Margaret and Stephanie, and we could decide that we're going to do a mentoring group on creating your annual budget, let's say. So we could create a space where people can go to in a social platform, hold a webinar much like this to kick it off, post some presentations, put in some links to relevant e-learning courses like finance for non-financial managers and so on, and link to other mentoring groups, perhaps strategic planning, and so on. And in a format like that where we're running a mentoring group for 3 months, we might be able to mentor 150 people. And then you could save, so think of it as kind of a subject matter expert facilitated topics that is self-organizing. And so as a mentor, so as a new employee comes in and says, Dad, do you guys offer mentoring? You can say, yes, we have dozens of mentoring groups. I mean, just on this call alone, we could have created 4 mentoring groups, let's say. And who theoretically could be, mentoring 600 people by just doing a few hours a quarter together. So I think that's one way to think about, mentoring and, it's a blended learning solution in many ways. From a non-training perspective, one of the things that PwC did was look at how do we train doctors, and they came up with, they went and followed doctors around at PwC, kind of at Johns Hopkins in collaboration with Duke Corporate Education, and found that that we can change the way people think about how they first come to work and learn by emphasizing that there's a learning component to work as well. So in a hospital, that means that you're doing rounds with a senior physician. At work, what they translated this to mean was it used to be that as a new employee at PwC, you would sit in the background and help support a team and create PowerPoint decks and do all of those kinds of things, whereas instead now you're thrown into client situations within your first 2 weeks. And you get a chance to not only be part of it, but actually do some of the presentation, so that by 6 months, you're actually an integral part of presenting to the team. And that progresses so that by the first year, somebody is following you around to see how you're doing. They build in a lot of feedback, and it's a requirement of the team. They train the teams on how to give feedback to one another. Most people are so, exactly, Linda, very much like a journeyman kind of situation. And they train them on how this should work. And the interesting thing they found out was that people were, they were so happy with it that if the managers stopped facilitating a process like this, they would just do it themselves. If the manager wouldn't hold the after-action review, they would do it themselves. And when you look at MBA programs and how they're designed now, most MBA programs now have a collaboration component where you're graded as a team, where you rate each other as a team, and so on. And so I think this is a really promising kind of practice to think about using with millennials. And it has a lot of implications as well, I think, for how we think about performance feedback and so on. So it's pretty exciting. Just one more, since somebody brought up COBOL, that I'll bring up, is one thing that American Express did was, they looked at their sort of folks who were running their systems and realized that a good portion of them were approaching retirement, and that they had many legacy systems that were COBOL. So, and they don't teach that in school anymore. And so, replacing the systems, of course, would be costly, and they were quite functional and working. So what they decided to do was offer a special incentive to essentially both ends of the career spectrum. So for those people who were very experienced and were working it, they offered them phased-in transition to retirement. So they could, if they agreed to mentor, to hold classes on COBOL and to mentor incoming professionals, they were allowed to graduate to retirement over a 1 to 2 year period. So they could start working part-time, still have benefits, and so on. And, which was interestingly just a highly sought-after program to participate in, because it is difficult to go from working 50 or 60 hours a week to just being on the golf course. So, so people really enjoyed that at America. That was a very successful program for American Express for training. I'm going to skip a section on leadership, but for those of you that are doing any leadership development, I think this whole transparency that's available and the ability to communicate with anyone outside work is going to become part of inside work. When you think about it, for example, right now, if you wanted to go write an email to the President of the United States, no matter what or who you are as a citizen, you can do that. That is part of how we think about our interaction with government now. And 20 years ago, that would have been kind of like a crazy person. But, now imagine a new millennial comes in, and that's how they're used to communicating with whomever it makes sense. And if they write a letter to the CEO, their first week says, "I'm so glad to be here, and by the way, I noticed, here's one thing that you might consider," that doesn't fly so well in organizations. So, how do we start to think about what is and how do we, help people learn kind of the way work is done, and how do we help leaders realize that there's a whole new way of communication that doesn't necessarily follow an organizational hierarchy. So let's play for a minute with just some of the predictions for the future. I think everyone's going to have a reputation score, particularly leaders, and these are going to be about your reputation as a subject matter expert. When you go to LinkedIn endorsements, for example, already I could, if everyone is on LinkedIn, I can tell a little bit about who's endorsed you and on what skills, and that was their choice to kind of crowdsource what are my capabilities, and how will this make it easy for people inside the company to go find their own subject matter experts to help them with things. Increasingly, you're going to be able, I think, to have an input at a minimum, if not elect your own leader. And although this might sound like very far-fetched, when you think about it, probably the most conservative people you work with are your auditors, who have, as partnerships, been electing their leaders for 100 years. Great. And then, also we have, not only electing your own leaders, but Gore is one of the companies that did indeed go elect their own leaders. And this is who they picked, someone who just really understood that people want to work in a collaborative network where information is freely shared, and that they want to know how and why they're making an impact. And I imagine everybody on the phone feels the same way. And some people say, well, gosh, is this just going to mean it's just a popularity contest? But, kind of a news flash, it already is. This is a pre-social media thing. And when people are asked, who do you go to when you need help on something, and off a scale of likable and capable, of course, number one, we always go to the person who's both capable and likable. And last place would be the incompetent jerk. But, surprisingly, even when we need help, it's easier to approach and see if we can't get some help from someone that's decent to work with. And so, life already is. All social media does is make things accessible. One of the biggest things that I think of as a place for people that are in e-learning to go grab as part of their domain is app development. I mean, how incredible would it be if on the first day for working at a company that has a lot of acronyms, you're given an app to download from the App Store with a code that's unique to the company. And then when you're sitting in a meeting and somebody uses acronyms, you're just quick looking them up on your phone as opposed to trying to download from a PDF from a website that you can't find, and so on. So, you know, I think that's just going to be one of the real opportunity spaces for people in learning. And also figuring out how do we use this wearable connectivity. Since I work in the San Francisco Bay Area, I do not go to a conference now without seeing people wearing Google Glass. So even small little conferences, and sometimes you'll see a dozen people wearing Google Glass to enable their experience at the conference. If you watch the TED Talks, 2 of the top 10 are about the sixth sense out of MIT, which again is this augmented reality. Somebody's developed contacts that provide a heads-up display at the University of Washington, and even vibrating tattoos have been patented by Nokia, so that you get an alert to let you know that you should be paying attention to something. So I think those are all you know, possible ways in which we're going to be able to integrate this augmented reality to enable people to be able to perform better on the job. And then finally, using this in just the most vast term of the word learning, I think enabling people to be able to connect peer-to-peer without having to go through a training department or through marketing is going to be, you know, kind of what happens inside organizations, and using crowdsourcing to rate content. We've had a very controlled environment, and you know, I didn't say in my introduction that one of the things I did was create a social learning platform and sell it to what's now SAP. So that's why I'm at SAP, is I'm in the kind of the social learning space. And I think, you know, getting that to a point where we as a training department are even comfortable with it. We've probably hit the broad acceptance of that now, but I think it can even go further. So to just wrap some things up, and then I'll open for some, you know, questions, and I'll kind of go back and scan some of these in the chat to make sure I haven't missed something where I should comment. You know, what can you do now? I think, you know, lots of programs, lots of companies that I'm looking at are doing things like setting up reverse mentoring programs, or they're setting up advisory committees so they can just kind of understand how do they make an impact. And you know, on both ends of the spectrum, I think understanding the language of business. So, you know, for young people, really understanding what it means to, you know, get in, have an idea, and execute on it. I saw somebody talking about, well, can they execute? You know, the interesting, I had a client at GE who ran an experiment where she gave the identical assignments, one to a team of millennials, one to a team of baby boomers, and with a deadline. And the baby boomers waited until close to the end of the deadline, presented a very polished product. The millennials, within a week, had a draft of something, came back, got feedback, iterated on it, came back again. So their process was a lot of interactions with iteration. And she said at the end, their work outputs were similar. It took more time from the, you know, the I love, this is a great comment on talk to middle-aged people. Thank you. But at the end, the products were very similar. You know, there are some organizations that are already 80 or 90% millennials. If the business model is we hire people fresh out of college and keep them for a few years and pass them on. And so, but, you know, I think it's interesting to kind of look at, you know, what they need to do. Yeah, Melissa, I think this, you know, Agile is kind of a mindset even of you know, how the millennials approach it. Get a lot of feedback. So, which is, interesting. It doesn't make one right or wrong. It's definitely different approaches. Not to overstate, that everybody would do it the same way. Our survey at SuccessFactors said that only 56% of recruiters were using tools to reach people online as candidates, and yet 85% of people say when they're looking for jobs, that's what they're doing. And, I think, really thinking about how people want to learn today and adapting our strategies, whether from an e-learning perspective, that means how do you make it more social, how do you build it with other things, how do you game, how do you build in motivational factors. I think there's dozens of ideas you can do to answer those questions. And we've talked about, mentoring as a program. I think that I can't imagine that I would build an e-learning program or any kind of learning program without incorporating it to a social platform of some sort so that learners can begin to congregate and meet one another in a program as just part of a complete total learning solution. And then if you happen to be responsible for leadership development, I think the other thing to think about is, how do we project what leaders are going to need to be for 2020? And there are companies like GE and Procter & Gamble who have 2020 leadership initiatives because it takes years to create a leader. So of course you should be thinking not only about how do successful leaders perform today, but how can we at least project what successful leaders will need tomorrow, so we begin preparing them for tomorrow. So is everyone ready? And, it looks like Bobby's been doing some online shopping as well while we're, because I can see the customer ID number, and thank you for your order. So, are there any questions I can answer? And Stephanie, I'm assuming everyone can go ahead and place their questions in chat. And if we don't have further questions, we can, allow you to cut back in as well to,
right.
to help wrap it up.
Everyone has chat access. I have a question for you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. How do communities of practice fit into all of this? We've seen a lot of social platforms, but what about the not so tangible communities of practice within an organization?
Yeah, I think you could take kind of this discussion we had on the AT&T scaling mentoring kind of thing and think of that as a community of practice as well. Should you take it further? I think the experience I've had with, the old communities of practice or old knowledge management platforms sometimes were very hierarchical, and you had to get your content reviewed before it could be stored in a shared domain, and it was just so onerous that people stopped doing it. So I think we have to allow for a lot of fluidity in the communities of practice, and that it takes a community manager to at least get things going. So, I don't have it in this presentation, but I have like an hour-long presentation on how do you build strong online social communities, whether they are specific to a community of practice or to, or to a content or a broader topic area. But, number one on my list would be have a community manager to get things started. We have facilitators for our classrooms, and I think solid communities of practice need someone to help guide the community, and that can be a rotating position. Okay, I see from Lori, are certain industries more open to social learning? Yes, I would say I would kind of tackle it from the opposite side. The industries where it's hardest for people to implement social learning are those that have heavy regulatory practice. And so, the financial services industry, FDA, those are a little harder. We are seeing even those start to get more active in social learning, but they constrain it to, for example, you can have social learning around just a class as opposed to an open Facebook-type forum or YouTube-type forum. But I think within a couple of years, and certainly this is the direction that SAP is headed in terms of product development, everything we do will have a social component. So every piece of software that you're working on will have a social feature built into it. So it's like saying, to me it's much like when people first got email. They were very controlling about who could have an account and so on. And then it just became, just the way we work. And I believe social is going to be the same thing, where it just kind of moves to the way we work. Okay, so I think the industry.
Okay, so
yeah.
Yeah, it looks like that's.
So I think we're.
Yeah, I think that's all the questions that we had. And people have started.
Yeah.
Well, Karie,
you have to get off. Yeah.
Thank you so much for presenting, and apologies for all the technical difficulties to everyone. Definitely, this is one of my newer platforms, so making it bug-free is a little newer.
Yeah.
But this was a fantastic presentation. I've heard several of these in recent months, and I really enjoyed this one, I have to say. So thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to present and speak with us. We will certainly post our notes in our eSIG blog. And Karie, could we get a copy of the slides, maybe a PDF?
Yeah. So should I just email them to you, Stephanie? You guys are, as long as you, just give credit where credit's due, because some of these stats are not my own. Everyone is free to use these. And
okay.
So I'll just send them to you, Stephanie?
Yeah, we'll make a PDF and post it to the blog. How's that?
That sounds great.
Okay, great. This session has been recorded, so as soon as I figure out how to get it so where it can stream, we will post this. So stay tuned, everyone, and thank you, everyone, also for your patience with today's session and for attending. It's been a great session. We will see you all again in hopefully in January. So until then, happy holidays. Sounds kind of early, but we will be out on December. So thank you again, everyone.
Thank you. Cheers.
Bye-bye.